For many, the death of killer Robert Pickton is a welcome end to a dark criminal story in Canadian history. But for others, the death of the notorious Port Coquitlam pig farmer leaves justice and closure out of their reach. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Vancouver Sun reporter Lori Culbert joins me to talk about Pickton's horrific crimes, why families of some women Pickton is suspected of killing are worried there are questions that will never be answered, and the impact this case has had on our country. Don't forget you can find us on all your favorite listening platforms, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Lori, there was big news out of a Quebec prison in the last couple of weeks about a name that is familiar to many Canadians, but may not be familiar to everybody for what he did. We're talking about Robert Pickton. It's a name many Canadians know, but there are many for whom he isn't more than the name of, he was a notorious criminal, and they may not remember the things that he was accused of and convicted of many years ago. So for those who may have forgotten some of the horrific details of his life, who was Robert Pickton and what was he ultimately convicted of doing?
Well, it's true. When Pickton was first arrested in 2002 and during his subsequent trial, there wasn't the type of social media coverage or availability of news online that there is today. And I think for a lot of people, they might recognize the name, but perhaps don't recall the details of this truly case. It's also a case that wasn't just horrific for the victims, but it did fortunately result in some improvements in Canada when it comes to the vulnerability and the safety of women. But we can talk about that in a few minutes. But to start off, Robert Pickton was a completely unknown pig farmer in a Vancouver suburb called Port Coquitlam. He had no criminal record. He had never been heard of by the general public until news broke in 2002 that he had been arrested in connection with the murders of several women who had disappeared from a very marginalized area of Vancouver called the Downtown East Side. Pickton would ultimately be charged and then convicted of killing 6 of those women in his 2007 trial. They are Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Joesbury, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papin, and Marnie Frey. And it was established at trial that they were all women who were selling sex to try to support their very vulnerable lifestyles, that Pickton had brought them to his farm and had killed them there.
And this was a case that caught headlines, not just in Canada, but around the world. It was a pretty horrific case, horrific trial. And I think a lot of people had hoped that when Robert Pickton went to jail, we probably wouldn't hear anything more from him until he died. And for the most part, I think Canadians, perhaps forgetting the details of what happened, given the years that have transpired, probably were surprised to hear some of them when news broke that he had been attacked in prison in Quebec. What can you tell me about the attack in prison that ultimately led to his death?
So on May the 19th, my colleague Kim Bolin and I both got word that Pickton, who is now 74, was attacked in a federal penitentiary called Port Cartier in Quebec. Sources tell us that he was speared in the head with what appeared to be a broken broom handle by another inmate. He was on life support in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks and was declared dead on May the 31st. This has brought, of course, the case back into the public conversation again, and it's brought really mixed emotions for the families of the victims. One Cynthia Cardinal, who's the sister of Georgina Papin, said to us after his attack, "Finally, the devil is gone." His crimes cast an ominous shadow over the families of so many victims. That was one response that we had from one of the family members.
And for others, I like with the Georgina Papin's family, it brings an end to a terrible saga for them. But I imagine there are still a lot of people who are waiting answers or waiting for justice, and it may never come in this case. As you mentioned, he was suspected of potentially killing more than 20 women, nearly 30 women, convicted of the deaths of 6 of them. Are there fears that some family members may never get the truth about what happened to their loved ones? What has the response been from those families?
So for sure. So to go back a little bit, Pickton was originally arrested in 2002. By the time his trial started in 2007, he had been charged with killing 27 women who had all disappeared from Vancouver's downtown East Side neighborhood. But before the trial started, 21 of those charges were severed from the 6 that went ahead. And the idea was that Pickton would face 2 separate trials and would be tried on the remaining counts in a second trial. When he was found guilty on the first 6 counts, the decision was made that there was therefore no need to proceed with the second trial because under Canadian law, he was facing the maximum sentence he could face with the 6 murder convictions. And what that did is it just left a lack of justice, a lack of answers, a lack of accountability for not just those 21 families, but also another 6 women whose DNA would eventually be linked to that farm, but for whom there was also never a conviction in court. So that brings to 27 the number of families who are desperately wanting some form of closure, some accountability, someone to be held responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. And potentially the number could be larger than 27 because when Pickton was originally put in jail, an undercover officer posed as his cellmate. And during that conversation, Pickton actually bragged to the undercover officer that he had killed 49 women. We don't know if that's true, but that is something that he told the officer in the jail cell. And we know that more than 60 women have vanished from Vancouver's downtown east side prior to his arrest.
So it's been more than 20 years since his arrest. And I imagine in the course of the investigation, police searched his property, seized troves of evidence relating to his crimes that he was convicted of and his alleged crimes. What is being done with that evidence? And is there hope on the part of the families that perhaps, even though that Pickton is dead, that there still may be investigative means to determine his involvement in the deaths of these other women?
So you're right. The police investigation of the pig farm that Pickton owned with his brother in Port Coquitlam became the largest forensic criminal investigation in Canadian history. The search went on for 18 months. It involved police officers and lab workers and anthropologists from across Canada. It tied up every lab in the country as it tested the DNA samples. In the end, those searchers collected 235 items from the farm, which included hair and blood and semen and other stains. It created more than 600,000 exhibits that needed to be tested in the labs. All of this was submitted in during his trial, his quite lengthy trial that spanned all of 2007. So that evidence was kept through his appeals, and now the RCMP say that there's no longer a requirement to keep the evidence that they still have. So the Mounties have made a court application to dispose of 14,000 exhibits that were seized from the property during the investigation. And it includes items like women's clothing, items that were found in Pickton's ramshackle, terrible buildings on the property, such as his slaughterhouse and his trailer. It includes some furniture. Police tell us it absolutely does not include any human remains. But the application to destroy these exhibits has upset the families who are still looking for justice and their advocates. They argue that destroying the exhibits could impact future investigations. And as, of course, DNA technology evolves and becomes better, they wonder why you wouldn't keep the baseball cap that police don't know who it belonged to, or the cowboy boot that they say right now they have no DNA evidence on. Because what if those pieces of evidence could somehow, through new and improved technology down the road, be found to provide answers for these families that currently don't have any?
We'll be right back. Is there a belief, either on the part of investigators or even the part of families, that there are other people who could have been involved who evaded justice?
So it's an interesting question. During Pickton's 2007 trial, his own defense team floated this idea of there being alternative suspects. And they focused on several people in particular who had access to the property, including Pickton's own brother and including several of Pickton's friends. And that defense team was an excellent group, I must say, of defense attorneys who created a lot of reasonable doubt around whether Pickton was acting alone. So, as a result of that evidence that was submitted at trial, a lawyer representing children of 13 of the women who've been linked to Pickton's farm has argued that these 14,000 pieces of evidence, who largely are of unknown ownership, should not be destroyed because, who knows who belongs to them and how we can find that out. And in particular, could they be tied back to any alternative suspects? Now, the police, I've done a lot of interviews over the years, and in particular in relation to this application to destroy the evidence. Two senior ranking RCMP officers have told me recently that that they've exhausted all the value from this evidence, that they've taken photographs of it, so they have records of it. They've preserved DNA samples, and they continue to insist that the hundreds of thousands of DNA swabs that have been tested in relation to this case have never pointed to an accomplice. Nor did any other investigative tools or any polygraph tests. So, from the position of the police, Robert Pickton is the sole perpetrator of these crimes.
You spent a lot of time covering this case, a lot of words written, a lot of hours devoted. I think it lends you to having more perspective than perhaps others in this country. When you look at the legacy of this case, what are some kind of key elements to it for you? Is it how policing has changed in the aftermath? Is it how it shined a light on the precarious circumstances of vulnerable women in Vancouver's East Side? Like, what are some of the ways that this case has changed the country?
I'd love to be able to tell you that the changes have been substantial. I'm not sure that advocates would agree with that, though. I think what this case did singularly is that it finally opened a conversation that needed to be had for years but wasn't, about the vulnerability of women who work in the sex trade and the vulnerability of women who are poor or impoverished. And the lack of focus on their victimization prior to Pickton's arrest, how they had no power and no voice, and how their families had no power and no voice to get people to listen to the fact that these women were disappearing off the street. I, so my colleagues and I in the year 2000, in the year 2001, we spoke with these families, we spoke with other women on the street who knew that victims were disappearing, but there wasn't there wasn't the empathy at that time in Canada among our politicians or among our police to to commit the resources that were required to investigate a case like this. And it was only after, quite frankly, the accidental arrest of Pickton in this case that we started to see some change happening. We started to see the conversation happening, and those changes did target policing, and they targeted trying to improve the situation for vulnerable women, and in particular, vulnerable Indigenous women and girls.
And that last bit is a key piece of this. This is a case that kind of loomed large over the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I believe it's been 5 years since the inquiry report, and there's a lot of talk. And as you mentioned earlier, the advocates would probably suggest that we haven't made a lot of progress on some of these issues. And specifically, when you look at some of the recommendations in that inquiry report, we kind of haven't made it that far. How does that play into this conversation around the Pickton case, do you think?
Yes, so, immediately after Pickton's arrest and in the ensuing years, as the number of charges he faced mounted and as the investigation on the farm continued and uncovered more and more horrific pieces of evidence, we started to see inquiries happen. We saw a Highway of Tears symposium in northern British Columbia in 2006 to start looking at women who were disappearing off that highway. In 2012, we had a provincial missing women inquiry led by a former Supreme Court justice who looked at, the role of police. And, that inquiry concluded that the missing women and their families were dismissed. That was the justice's word. They were dismissed by Vancouver police when their families reported them missing. Those inquiries came out with a long list of changes that were recommended. Some of them have been enacted, but certainly not all of them. And then, of course, about a decade ago, Canada had started a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Again, as I would argue, a direct result of this Pickton case and everything that's been uncovered since then. That inquiry spoke with 1,500 victims and their families from across Canada. And when the final report was issued in 2019, it made 231 recommendations for change to try to protect Indigenous women and girls. And it's been exactly 5 years since that report was finished. And the Assembly of First Nations just this week issued a report that found that only 2 of the 231 recommendations have actually been enacted upon 5 years later.
It's not the ringing endorsement of Canada's ability to address some of these issues. Do you, as someone who's covered this case for a long time, covered this story for a long time, what are your big takeaways from it? What have you seen in your reporting on this case that's kind of made you either rethink how media approaches it or rethink how police approach investigations like this? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think as members of the media, we learn a lot from cases like this. We learn to hopefully not be judgmental. We learn to understand that where a person is today, whether they are selling sex or they have an addiction to substances, that there's a reason that's brought them to this perilous state, right? We learn as members of the media now today to ask, what happened in your life that has brought you to this state, to better understand the victims and their families and the backstories behind what made them so vulnerable. And it's understanding those backstories that allow us to understand what needs to change, right? I mean, so if that means police listening better when families are reporting their loved ones missing, if that means trying to work with vulnerable women and trying to help them keep their children instead of the child welfare system taking the kids right away, if that means providing services and supports to try to keep women on the street safe, to try to meet them where they're at. Those are things that we learn, I think, as media over the decades when we cover these types of stories, to have empathy and to have better knowledge and understanding about the backstories and how those backstories help us to write about what needs to change. And it isn't just the media. I mean, we have seen changes in police, absolutely. Since that, scathing inquiry found that Vancouver police outright dismissed these women, we we now see that there's been improvement in communication between police agencies. We see the formation of regional homicide teams, for example, in Vancouver, so that police agencies can work together to try to solve these cases, which was a big barrier in the Pickton case because the women were disappearing from one police jurisdiction, that Pickton lived in a completely separate police jurisdiction. However, the provincial missing women inquiry called 12 years ago for the creation of a regional police force across Metro Vancouver, which we haven't seen happen. So there are steps forward, but unfortunately, there's still so many steps that need to be had.
Yeah. Well, hopefully even though the case brings an end to Robert Pickton's life, that some of these conversations still continue on, even in his absence. Lori, thanks for your time.
You're welcome, Dave. Thanks so much for having me and allowing me to speak about this important story.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Lori Culbert. More from her at vancouversun.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.